Okay, here we are at the third of our endocrine lectures. We're going to continue looking at the pituitary gland, but today we're looking at the anterior pituitary. So let's go ahead and start with some not really attendance questions. What is a tropic hormone? Where is oxytocin, OT, synthesized? And what are the function or functions of ADH? So go ahead and try to answer these on your own. And now let's look at the answers. What is a tropic hormone? A tropic hormone is a hormone that stimulates or inhibits the release of another hormone. Typically, when you see a source talking about tropic hormones, they mean it's a hormone released from one gland, which then tells a second gland to release its hormone. But really, a tropic hormone is just a hormone that's released from one gland and then interacts with the second gland, either stimulating the release or inhibiting the release of a different hormone. Next, where is oxytocin, OT, synthesized? Well, oxytocin and ADH are unique in that they are the only hormones that are made in one gland but stored in and released from a separate gland. So oxytocin and ADH are synthesized, they're made in the hypothalamus, but they are stored in and released from the posterior pituitary. And finally, what are the function or functions of ADH, antidiuretic hormone? Well, ADH, typically when we think about ADH, we talk about how it stimulates the creation of aquaporin type 2 so that we get increased water reabsorption in the late nephron. But remember the other name of ADH? Vasopressin or arginine vasopressin? It's got that name because it is a vasoconstrictor. And a lot of students forget that by this point in the semester. So ADH, it has two jobs: increased water reabsorption and vasoconstriction, both of which will have the effect of raising blood pressure. So here we are again talking about the pituitary gland, and we talked about how the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus are really, really intimately connected. And we've talked about how the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary work. Here's that paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. That's where oxytocin and ADH are made. They travel down. They're stored here in the posterior pituitary in those axon terminals. And then when these neurons send action potentials down, the axon terminals release either oxytocin or ADH, which is then picked up by this capillary and then carried off to the body. Now today, we're going to be talking about the anterior pituitary gland. And the anterior pituitary gland is a normal gland. It synthesizes, it makes its own hormones. Now we're going to talk about a lot of hormones today. And again, it's going to be like last time when we're talking about hormones, it's going to be a lot of me reading to you. And some of it I'm going to go through in a little more depth. Some of it I might skip over because it's already written in your outline. But you are responsible for knowing all of it. So here now we've kind of blacked out or grayed out the posterior pituitary. Now we're looking just at the anterior pituitary, which is still under the control of the hypothalamus. But we're going to do things really differently here. Now, in this case, the hypothalamus still has neurons that are going to release some hormones, but it's really different. If we look at the layout of these neurons as opposed to the layout of the neurons we talked about last class, here we see the neurons extend all the way down into the posterior pituitary. But in the anterior, it's different. In the hypothalamus, these neurons extend down and stop right at the start of the infundibulum. They do not extend down into the anterior pituitary. Now we also can see a layout of blood vessels here, and this is called the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary portal system, or the hypofeasial portal system. So let's look at the layout of that, and then we're going to talk about how everything works. We have arteries, arterioles, branching smaller and smaller and smaller. Here's one of our arteries, or really it's an arteriole, that brings blood to this first capillary bed that surrounds the infundibulum, right around where these neurons have their axon terminals. Now here's this capillary bed. And then as we leave the capillary bed, normally when you leave a capillary bed, you go into a venule, and then to a vein, and then back to the heart. Here it's different. We go from this capillary bed into something called portal veins or portal venules that then go to a second capillary bed. This second capillary bed surrounds the anterior pituitary, and then blood drains out of there into a venule, ultimately into a vein, and then off to the heart to be carried to the rest of the body. So it's a different layout, and it's going to work with the hypothalamus to communicate with the anterior pituitary. So let's go back to the hypothalamus and look at what hormones are released from these neurons. These are going to be tropic hormones. These are the hormones we just said either cause the release of, or in some cases inhibit the release of, other hormones from other glands. In this case, the hormones that we're looking at are GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone. So if they have RH, they are releasing hormones. These are the ones that stimulate the release of something else. If they have IH, these are ones that inhibit the release of something else. Now we will look at each of these individually. I know I read through them really quick, but we're going to come back to them all. So let's look first just at GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, as an example, but we will look at all of them individually here shortly. In the case of growth hormone releasing hormone, when stimulated, these neurons, some of them are going to release growth hormone releasing hormone. They come out of these axon terminals right here and enter this capillary bed. The growth hormone releasing hormone is then carried to the next capillary bed that surrounds the anterior pituitary. And that growth hormone releasing hormone will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone into this capillary bed, which then leaves to go have an effect on the body. So the hypothalamus is still controlling the pituitary, it's just controlling it differently. Here it's controlling it by release of tropic hormones that tell the anterior pituitary when to release or stop releasing various hormones. Now, if we look at the last page of our outline, we have this chart, and this is going to show us exactly how the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. So what I've got here is the hypothalamus can release these hormones. These hormones then tell the anterior pituitary to release or stop releasing these hormones. For example, GHRH tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Prolactin inhibiting hormone, for example, tells the anterior pituitary to stop releasing prolactin. Or corticotropin releasing hormone tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which is also called corticotropin. ACTH then travels to the adrenal cortex to tell it to release its hormones. So this is how we read this chart. Now we're going to go through all of these individually. This just kind of sums it all up for you. As we go through this chart, if you don't like the way this chart is laid out, your book actually gives a different version of this chart on page 635. This is the image from page 635, and it shows what the hypothalamus releases to the anterior pituitary, and then what the anterior pituitary does to the rest of the body in response to that. So everything we're talking about today comes from one of these two charts, depending on which one you like to look at best. So now we're going to go on and start looking at the different hormones. And we're going to look at the anterior pituitary hormones, but we're also going to talk about which of those hypothalamic tropic hormones are related. So first we're going to look at growth hormone, GH, which is also called somatotropin. Somatotropin, or growth hormone, is a protein, so it's an amino acid-based hormone. And its stimulus is growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. But I've also got some other stimuli here. So these other stimuli are really what tell the hypothalamus to release growth hormone releasing hormone. The stimulus for growth hormone is growth hormone releasing hormone. But if we backtrack, the stimuli for growth hormone releasing hormone, there are several. For example, low growth hormone levels. Well, this is just a classic negative feedback loop. When growth hormone levels are low, GHRH is stimulated. GHRH tells growth hormone to be released. And then as growth hormone levels rise, it cuts off the secretion of GHRH. Also stimulating GHRH, hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar. Increased blood amino acids, low blood fatty acids, exercise, and a hormone we'll talk about later called ghrelin. This is from the stomach. Growth hormone is inhibited by a drop in GHRH and a rise in GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And again, this is negative feedback. But in addition to negative feedback, we've also got something called insulin-like growth factors, which can feed back and cut off GH. Insulin-like growth factors are things very similar to insulin released from various body cells. And insulin-like growth factors actually allow growth hormone to have its effects on a lot of body tissues. So as growth hormone rises, IGFs also rise, and then growth hormone and IGFs feed back to tell the hypothalamus stop releasing GHRH, and it also stops the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. We've also got other things that inhibit GH release. Hyperglycemia, a rise in blood sugar. Hyperlipidemia, a rise in blood fatty acids. And obesity. The function of growth hormone, anabolism, which is just general body growth. It's building of larger molecules. Growth of liver, growth of muscle. Indirectly, it causes the growth of bone. Really what it does is it causes the growth of cartilage, and then it also speeds the conversion of cartilage to bone. Most other tissues also stimulated for growth. It mobilizes fats for metabolism. Basically, that just means fats in your body, it makes them more likely to be broken down for metabolism and used as energy. It spares glucose. That means normally our body goes to glucose as an energy source, but when growth hormone is present, we kind of bypass glucose, instead using fats. Growth promoting effects indirectly by insulin-like growth factors. So like I said a minute ago, insulin-like growth factors allow growth hormone to have its effect at a lot of our body tissues. But insulin-like growth factors actually can kind of interfere with insulin. So when growth hormone levels are high, insulin doesn't get to do its job as well. So growth hormone has anti-insulin effects, which causes blood sugar levels to rise because our body can't respond to the insulin since it's busy responding to the growth hormone and the IGFs. Now, as a side effect of this, growth hormone actually shortens lifespan. And even though growth hormone is needed for human development and to reach, what's considered a normal size, other than that, growth hormone is pretty bad for us. And in some animals, such as something called the dwarf Ames mouse, some animals don't produce growth hormone. So there is a type of mouse called an Ames mouse, and some of them have a defect to where they don't produce growth hormone. Now, the dwarf Ames mouse is only about half the size of the normal Ames mouse because it doesn't produce growth hormone. But the dwarf Ames mouse lives almost twice as long as the regular Ames mouse. So it doesn't get as big, but it lives a lot longer. So that's simply because of the growth hormone not being present to block the effects of insulin. Let's look at some disorders for growth hormone. Hypersecretion, so excess growth hormone, typically results from either a tumor near the anterior pituitary or a blow to the head. Sometimes getting hit in the head can cause excess growth hormone to be released. And depending on the age of onset, you can get something called gigantism or acromegaly. Now, gigantism is what happens when too much growth hormone is being released starting in childhood. Acromegaly is you've had normal growth hormone levels, but once you've passed adolescence and entered adulthood, then you start releasing growth hormone. And what we see here on the left, this is someone who has gigantism. Here's a normal height man and someone with gigantism. This person had growth hormone in excess from childhood. Over here on the right, we see a normal sized man and someone with acromegaly. And if we look at the man with acromegaly, we can see he's pretty much a normal height. These two guys are pretty much the same height. But looking at this man, you can tell something is different. He's normal height, but something is up. And if we compare the head of the man with acromegaly to the normal, his head is much longer, much larger. His nose is much larger. His chin is very thick and juts. We can see his hands are much bigger. If he wasn't wearing this robe, his wrists, his elbows, his knees would actually be much bigger. So that's acromegaly. Now, a hyposecretion would be something called pituitary dwarfism. Now, as an adult, not having enough growth hormone isn't going to have too much of an effect. But hyposecretion of growth hormone as a child will make someone noticeably smaller because they don't get that growth spurt. They don't have that stimulation from growth hormone to get bigger, and they will be very, very small. Now let's use that previous picture as a thinking cap question. Why does hypersecretion of growth hormone, excess growth hormone, present as gigantism when it strikes in children, But the exact same thing presents as acromegaly when it strikes in adulthood. So both of these, they have the exact same cause. Gigantism, acromegaly. Both of them are excess growth hormone. Over here on the left, it's excess growth hormone from childhood. Over here on the right, it's excess growth hormone after adult onset. So think about why the difference would be if they're the exact same cause. Well, in childhood, remember the epiphyseal plates, the growth plates, they're still open. So they're being stimulated to grow much more than normal because of that excess growth hormone. The long bones get much longer, and that causes this excess in growth in length of long bones. This person gets very, very tall. Over here in acromegaly, it doesn't strike until adulthood. And by then, the growth plates, the epiphyseal plates, have sealed. And once those growth plates seal into the epiphyseal line, it doesn't matter how much stimulation to grow we put on them, they can't grow any longer. Once those growth plates seal, no more growth in length will occur. So this person doesn't get any taller, he's still normal height, but bones can still get thicker. So things like the flat bones of the skull or the short bones in the wrist. So we see bones getting much thicker, but not longer. And typically in acromegaly, we see the skull, the joints, the hands and feet are much bigger, but they're not any taller. Moving on, now we're going to look at thyrotropin, or thyroid stimulating hormone. So here the hypothalamus releases thyrotropin releasing hormone, which tells the anterior pituitary to release thyrotropin, thyroid stimulating hormone, travels to the thyroid, tells it to release T3, T4, collectively called thyroid hormone. So thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary is a glycoprotein. So it's an amino acid based hormone that just happens to have some carbohydrates attached to it. And the stimulus for TSH is TRH. The stimulus here for TSH is TRH from the hypothalamus. Also, in infants, cold temperature can stimulate TSH. It's inhibited by negative feedback from T3, T4. So if we go through the flow chart here, hypothalamus releases TRH, tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH, tells the thyroid to release T3, T4, thyroid hormone. As those T3, T4 levels rise, it feeds back and tells both the hypothalamus to stop releasing TRH and tells the anterior pituitary to stop releasing TSH. Also, growth hormone inhibiting hormone will stimulate or will reduce the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary. So TRH levels dropping and GHIH levels rising will inhibit TSH. Its function is it is tropic to the thyroid to release T3, T4 thyroid hormone. Hypersecretion of TSH is or can lead to one type of hyperthyroidism. We're going to talk about hyperthyroidism when we get to the thyroid gland, but one type of hyperthyroidism can be caused by excess TSH. And that results in elevated T3, T4, which we will come back to in our next lecture when we talk about the thyroid. Hyposecretion of TSH can lead to, in children, something called cretinism, which is congenital hypothyroidism. In adults, it leads to something called myxedema. Now, in children, this is a lot bigger deal because it cuts off the release of T3, T4, and T3, T4, thyroid hormone, is essential for development of the fetus and toddler. So if you have hypothyroidism, cretinism, in children, you can get things like mental retardation. So you don't fully develop mentally. You get short body of disproportionate size. So that means not only are you small, some parts are more small, whereas some parts are a little larger. So you're not just small, you're disproportionate. Thick tongue, which oftentimes will spill out of the mouth. It's like the tongue is too big to fit in the mouth. Thick neck. And this can be genetic, or it can be a dietary insufficiency from the mother. So if the mother doesn't have adequate iodine in her diet, then the child can get cretinism. Now we'll talk about why iodine is so important when we talk about thyroid hormone in our next lecture. In adults, hyposecretion of TSH can lead to myxedema, which leads to hypothyroidism, and we get things like decreased metabolic rate, chills, constipation, lethargy, which is just general feeling of tiredness, and mental fatigue. So we're going to see in the next class how important the thyroid is for practically everything in the body. And if you don't have enough TSH, then you won't have enough T3, T4, thyroid hormone. Next, ACTH, Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now this is going to be the flow chart. Hypothalamus hypothalamus releases CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, tells the anterior pituitary to release corticotropin, ACTH, which then tells the adrenal cortex to release a batch of hormones that we'll talk about in the next class: cortisol, aldosterone, and the androgens. Now, the stimulus for ACTH is CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, but also fever, hypoglycemia, and stress. Well, the fever, hypoglycemia, and stress release CRH, and then CRH releases ACTH. It is inhibited by negative feedback of cortisol. So if it goes hypothalamus releases CRH, tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, tells the adrenal cortex to release its hormones, these hormones rise. Cortisol, as it rises, it feeds back, tells the hypothalamus to stop releasing CRH, and it tells the anterior pituitary to stop releasing ACTH. So it's cortisol that's causing the negative feedback loop. Its function is it is tropic to the adrenal cortex. It also has the ability to stimulate melanin production in melanocytes. We will see why here in just a moment. Hypersecretion of ACTH can cause something called Cushing's disease. Now we'll talk about Cushing's disease in a couple of lectures when we talk about the adrenal gland. So the release of this hormone, it's a little more complicated than we make it seem here. It's not so much that CRH tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. Let's go over to our whiteboard and see exactly how this really works. So we have the hypothalamus releases CRH, and CRH tells the anterior pituitary to release, we said, ACTH, but that's not really what happens. Instead, there is this very, very large protein complex called pro-opiomelanocortin, POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin. Now, pro-opiomelanocortin, this very large protein that the anterior pituitary makes in response to CRH, is cleaved up while it's still in the anterior pituitary. One of the products is endorphins. Endorphins, the feel-good hormone. Next, MSH, the melanocyte stimulating hormone. Remember, melanocytes are the cells in our skin that release melanin, which is what gives us that tan color. And the other portion is ACTH, which then travels to the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, aldosterone, and the androgens, which are testosterone and estrogen from the adrenal cortex. Cortisol feeds back to the hypothalamus to say stop releasing CRH, and to the anterior pituitary to tell it to stop releasing these hormones. That cuts off the loop. But let's look at something interesting. We said when there is excess ACTH, or when there is, too much ACTH, we can get excess tanning of the skin. Well, let's look at how that all came to be known. MSH, the melanocyte stimulating hormone, is the same substance released from keratinocytes in the skin when there is some sort of UV damage. The keratinocytes release MSH, which stimulates the melanocytes to make melanin. So it seems like if there was excess POMC, that the MSH would stimulate the melanocytes. That would make sense. But as they start watching the anterior pituitary gland, it never releases any MSH. The MSH actually gets degraded before it has a chance to leave the anterior pituitary. The only thing that leaves the anterior pituitary in response to CRH are the endorphins, make you feel good, and the ACTH. Now, ACTH normally does not do anything for skin. It doesn't have any real effect on our skin color. But if we look at it, at the molecular level, it kind of resembles the shape of MSH. And remember, proteins, when they have a similar shape, their functions can overlap. So ACTH can stimulate melanocytes to make melanin. Normally, when everything is functioning as it should, ACTH levels are so low that they really don't have an effect on our skin color. But when there is hypersecretion of ACTH, when there is lot of ACTH, it can stimulate the melanocytes. So keep that in mind, not next lecture when we're doing the thyroid gland, but the lecture after that when we're doing the adrenal gland, we're going to come back to that because it's going to be a diagnostic tool. Okay, so the hypothalamus releases CRH, which tells the anterior pituitary to make POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin. POMC is cleaved into endorphins, feel-good hormone, MSH, which never leaves the pituitary gland, it gets degraded, and ACTH. Then the ACTH travels to the adrenal cortex, tells it to release cortisol, aldosterone, testosterone, and estrogen. Cortisol levels feed back to the hypothalamus and to the anterior pituitary, telling them, okay, you can stop releasing your hormones now. I know that was a lot to take in, so pause the recording if you need to. Let that sink in for a little bit, and then let's go back to our lecture here. Next, we're going to talk about the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Collectively, these two hormones together are called gonadotropin. Gonadotropin, FSH and LH, have a stimulus of GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus releases GnRH, GnRH tells the anterior pituitary to release both FSH and LH, gonadotropin, which travels to the gonads and has its effects there. And they're going to be different. So these two, they're released at the same time. And these two are going to have dramatically different effects on males versus females. So first, let's look at FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Its stimulus is GnRH. It is inhibited by negative feedback by inhibin and estrogen in females and testosterone in males. Its function in males is spermatogenesis, which is formation of sperm cells. In females, its function is ovarian follicle maturation. So in lab, when you're looking at the slides, you see on the ovary slide the various stages of ovarian follicles. Well, those that are maturing in response to FSH. It also stimulates estrogen production from the ovaries. Hyposecretion of FSH in males or females will result in failure to reach sexual maturity. Hypersecretion, there's nothing really relevant. Now, luteinizing hormone, LH, which is the other half of gonadotropin, luteinizing hormone is also stimulated by GnRH. It is inhibited by negative feedback of progesterone and estrogen in females and testosterone in males. Its function in males is testosterone production and secretion. In females, its function is ovulation, so release of the egg from the ovary, and also estrogen and progesterone production via a part of the ovary called the corpus luteum, which is left over after the egg is released. Hyposecretion, again, just like we saw with FSH, is failure to reach sexual maturity. And finally, prolactin, PRL. PRL is a little different. Typically, it's not that it is stimulated to be released, although TRH can stimulate PRL release. Really, it's the drop of PIH that stimulates its release. So, hypothalamus releases PIH, prolactin stops being released. Hypothalamus stops releasing PIH, and prolactin starts to be released, although TRH can stimulate the release of PRL, prolactin. So, prolactin, it's a protein. Again, it's an amino acid-based hormone. Its stimulus is decrease PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone, and or increase in TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. It can also be stimulated by estrogens, certain types of birth control pills, breastfeeding, and dopamine blocking drugs. So let's look real quick at the dopamine blocking drugs. Why would they stimulate the release of prolactin? Well, prolactin inhibiting hormone is dopamine. Dopamine and prolactin inhibiting hormone are the same thing. So if we block dopamine, a neurotransmitter, we are in effect blocking prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is one of the stimuli for prolactin to be released. It's inhibited by prolactin inhibiting hormone. So when PIH is released, prolactin is not. Its function is lactation. Its hypersecretion results in something called galactorrhea, which is just excess milk production. But it can also cause Menses sensation, which is just the stopping of the menstrual cycle. And in males, it can cause impotence. Hyposecretion results in poor milk production. in females. In males, there's not really a significance with hypoprolactin. But in females, it can result in them not making enough milk to nurse a baby. All right, so that's where we will stop. Tomorrow when we begin, or in the next lecture when we begin, we're going to talk about the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. So I will talk to you guys soon.